Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something that I think a lot of us feel, that hums beneath the surface sometimes. It's the fear of negative evaluation.
Exactly. That little clutch in your stomach when you think someone might not approve of what you're saying or doing.
Yeah, exactly that.
Yeah.
So what does that really involve? Let's break it down.
Well, our sources define it as sort of a mix of things. Apprehension about others' evaluations, sure, but
Hmm.
also real distress over negative judgments and even like expecting to be evaluated negatively.
Expecting it.
Yeah. And it's specific, not just general shyness. It's really about that evaluation piece.
Okay, that makes sense intuitively. But as a defined concept, where did FNE, this fear of negative evaluation, actually come from?
Right. So the term and the solid concept really came together in 1969. David Watson and Ronald Friend did the key work here.
Watson and Friend. Okay.
Yeah, they didn't just define it, which was huge, but they also developed a psychological test, a way to actually measure how much FNE someone experiences.
Ah, measure it. That's crucial for studying it, I guess.
Absolutely. It moved it from just an idea to something, well, quantifiable.
And I heard there are a couple of versions of this test.
That's right. The original one had 30 items, quite comprehensive. But then later, Mark Leary came up with a shorter 12-item version. People usually call it the BFNE.
BFNE for brief fear of negative evaluation.
You got it. And the interesting thing is, even though it's much shorter, the brief version correlates really well with the original.
So it's reliable.
Very. Both versions show good internal consistency too, meaning the questions are all tapping into that same core construct, that fear of being judged badly.
Okay, so it's a solid concept with decent measurement tools. Now, a key question for me is, how is this different from just, general social anxiety or awkwardness? Is dreading small talk the same as FNE?
That's a really important distinction to make. While someone high in FNE might also feel socially anxious, the research suggests FNE itself isn't super strongly correlated with other measures of social apprehension.
Like what kind of measure?
Well, things like the sad person scale, which is more about broader depression and risk factors, or the interaction anxiousness scale, which looks at general anxiety and interactions. FNE is more laser focused on the evaluation aspect.
Gotcha. So less about the interaction itself, more about the potential judgment within it.
Precisely. It's that core fear of being seen negatively.
Okay, that clarifies things. So if someone does score high on FNE, what other kinds of personality traits might we expect to see based on the research?
Well, the sources point towards connections with general anxiousness, for one. Also, a tendency towards submissiveness in interactions.
Submissiveness.
Yeah, and also social avoidance. Kind of makes sense, right? If you're very worried about being judged negatively.
You might be more anxious overall, maybe less likely to, push your own point of view.
Exactly. And you might just avoid situations where you feel like you'll be under the microscope.
Okay, this is where it gets really fascinating for me. How does this underlying fear actually play out in people's behavior? Like day to day?
Right. So people with high FNE often have this really strong drive for social approval. They really want to avoid disapproval.
Okay.
So this can mean they actively steer clear of evaluative situations. Think presentations, maybe even just disagreeing in a meeting.
Right, avoiding the spotlight.
Yeah. And what's also interesting is they tend to be very sensitive to situational cues, very aware of what's going on around them socially.
And that leads to,
Well, it can lead to increased conformity, just kind of going along with the group.
makes sense, safety in numbers.
Sort of.
Yes,
Or
yeah.
it could drive more pro-social behavior, doing things specifically to be liked or accepted. And as we touched on, it's definitely tangled up with social anxiety.
So social anxiety is like the emotional reaction fueled by the FNE.
That's a great way to put it. FNE is the underlying dread of the negative judgment. And social anxiety is often the feeling, the nervousness, the discomfort that flares up in response to that dread in social situations.
Okay, so we're building a solid picture here. Let's dig a bit deeper into that social anxiety link. You mentioned it's particularly strong for people with social phobia.
Yes, for individuals diagnosed with social phobia, that fear of negative evaluation can become especially intense when they think about their relationships, particularly close ones. It's like the fear gets amplified in those already sensitive areas.
Right, the stakes feel higher.
Yeah.
I read about a study, something with faces and giving a speech.
Yeah.
A dot probe thing.
Ah, yes, the dot probe paradigm. That was quite revealing. Basically, they showed participants different images, including faces showing negative emotions, right before they had to prepare a speech.
Okay.
And the finding was that participants who scored high on FNE showed a much bigger jump in apprehension after seeing those negative faces. Low FNE participants didn't really react the same way.
Wow. So even subtle negative cues can really ramp up the anxiety for high F&E folks if they know they're about to be evaluated.
Exactly. It highlights how sensitive they can be to potential signs of disapproval. Those small signals loom larger.
Hmm. Now, this next connection really caught my eye, the link between FNE and body image, even eating disorders.
Yes, this is a really significant finding in the research. FNE often ranks very highly as a contributing factor to negative body image and even the development or maintenance of eating disorders.
More so than other things.
Some studies suggest it might be even more influential than, say, depression or social comparison, though those are obviously important too. The idea is that the constant worry about how others judge their physical appearance becomes a central driver.
So the fear of being judged on their looks fuels body dissatisfaction and potentially harmful eating attitudes.
That seems to be the mechanism. That fear of negative physical evaluation can be incredibly powerful and damaging.
That really underscores how deep this fear can go, affecting our very relationship with ourselves.
Okay, thinking about where it comes from, is it all learned experiences or is there more to it?
Well, there's growing evidence for a genetic component. Much like other personality traits, think trait anxiousness, submissiveness, social avoidance seem to have some heritability. FNE might too.
Exactly. Twin studies looking specifically at the BFNE scores have found evidence of a genetic influence.
Interesting.
And what's more, these scores also show genetic links with measures from things like the Dimensional Assessment of Personality Pathology Basic Questionnaire, which looks at broader personality difficulties.
So the genes influencing FNE might play a role in a whole spectrum of anxiety-related personality stuff.
That's the implication, yeah. It suggests there might be some underlying biological predispositions that make certain individuals more vulnerable to this specific fear and related tendencies. It's not all environment.
That adds a really important layer to understanding it. Okay, let's shift slightly. How does FNE affect judgment and perception? Not just of ourselves, but how we see others too.
This is where things get quite nuanced. Studies indicate that people who score higher in FNE are often more accurate at identifying negative emotional expressions in others.
Really? More accurate?
Yeah, it's like they're almost hyper-tuned to picking up potential disapproval or negativity. Vigilant, you might say.
Okay, but what about how they see themselves?
Ah, that's where the flip side comes in. When evaluating their own performance, especially in something like public speaking, high FNE individuals tend to overestimate the negative aspects.
Like how awkward they seem?
Exactly, or how many pauses they took, they magnify the perceived flaws, and at the same time, they often underestimate their positive qualities like how confident or self-assured they actually came across.
While low FNE people.
Tend to do the opposite, actually. They often overestimate how effective they were in, say, that public speaking scenario.
Wow, so high F1E folks are tougher critics of themselves, but maybe better readers of others' potential criticism. That's quite a paradox.
It is rather fascinating.
So what about actual performance? Does this fear help or hinder when the pressure's on?
It's a mixed bag, interestingly. Despite their harsher self-critique, some research suggests high FNE speakers can actually be more effective communicators.
More effective.
Well, the thinking is that their heightened awareness of potential negative judgment might make them more careful, clearer, and maybe more attuned to the listener's understanding.
So the worry makes them try harder to be understood.
Potentially, yes, in terms of message clarity at least. However, when you look at performance under pressure, like in sports,
Okay.
there the picture often changes. Take basketball players, for instance. Studies show low FNE players tend to maintain their performance level under pressure.
And the high FNE players.
They often show a significant drop in performance when the pressure mounts. That worry about being judged negatively seems to actively interfere with their ability to execute skills effectively in those high-stakes moments.
That makes total sense. The cognitive load of the worry itself probably gets in the way.
Very likely, yes. It becomes a distraction and increases physiological stress.
Okay, so as we start to kind of wrap this up, let's summarize the really key takeaways about this fear of negative evaluation. What should we remember?
I think the main things are F&E is this specific fear about others' judgments, and the distress negative feedback causes. It's measurable, linked to traits like anxiousness and avoidance, but distinct from general social anxiety.
Right, that distinction is key.
Yeah. And it has real-world impacts influencing social anxiety, certainly, but also body image, potentially eating disorders. There's likely a genetic piece, too.
And the interesting twists on perception and performance.
Exactly. Better at spotting negative emotions in others, maybe, but harsher on themselves.
Mhm.
And while it might sometimes lead to clearer communication, it can definitely undermine performance under pressure.
Perfect. And just to reiterate that crucial point, F&E is the dread, the anticipation, while social anxiety is often the emotional reaction to that dread.
Well,
So as we finish this deep dive, here's something for you, the listener, to maybe reflect on. Knowing how this fear of negative evaluation can touch so many parts of life, communication, performance, self-image, how, might understanding it better change how you approach social situations or challenges? Could just recognizing F&E, maybe in yourself, maybe in others, give you a new lens on why people behave the way they do? Definitely some food for thought there. Thanks for joining us.